Hi, everyone. This is Katie Otto, Director of Communications at Juvenile Law Center. We're going to be getting started here, and just wait a few minutes while people join the conference. And Jenny, I'm going to be sharing the screen with you.
Okay.
Great. We're going to give people a few minutes.
Katie, you're able to see my screen, is that right? Katie?
Yep. We're going to be starting in I can see your screen now.
Okay, excellent. Yep.
We'll be
Great.
starting in, I see some people logging on,
no
so
problem.
we'll be starting in 1 minute.
No problem. I just wanted to make sure.
Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Katie Otto. I'm Director of Communications at Juvenile Law Center. We're glad that you took time and are able to join us today for our Older Youth and Foster Care 101 for reporters. We're going to start this call. Please, just a couple of housekeeping things. If you have any problems seeing your screen or hearing us, you can chat in the chat box with me, and I'll try to answer those questions while Jenny Pokempner, Senior Attorney, is presenting. We also have shared some handouts, and you should be able to see them in the handout section. If there are any problems with that, please also use the chat or the question box, and I'll try to see if I can help with that too. But I'm going to turn it over to Jenny Pokempner, and we'll have time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. Thanks very much for joining us.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie. And thanks everyone for joining us. As Katie said, we'll do some questions at the end, but we do have a pretty small group. So I'm happy if you do want to chat questions in as I'm going through some of the material to try to answer them as we go along. So please do feel free to do that. But again, thanks for joining. As Katie said, we said this is a 101, and I will admit that this might be a slightly more than a 101. So again, another reason to please chat in if you have questions. Really going to attempt to give background, but probably will go a little higher than 101 just to give you a little more details about this population with respect to the child welfare system. But I'm going to just go ahead and get started. What we hope to do today is give you a basic and general sense of kind of who transition age or older youth in the child welfare system are, understanding what their needs are. We really do look at this time period and age group as a distinct time of child and adolescent development, and that it requires certain things both in terms of services but also in terms of policy and law. And so kind of understanding what that means in terms of policy and understanding kind of who these youth are. We're going to share some trends related to kind of child welfare policy and practice related to transition age youth. There definitely are some exciting and interesting things going on, so we definitely want to make you aware of those things and things to kind of look out for both in the states but also on the federal level. And then we did want to share some of our priorities so you kind of know what we're working on. And definitely we're happy to answer questions going forward about this age group in child welfare as well as juvenile justice, but wanted to let you know some of the important things we're going to be focusing on in our work in Pennsylvania and across the country. One of the things we wanted to start out with was just some terms, because we try really hard when we're talking to everyone, including reporters, to not use too much lingo. But we do know that there are a lot of terms in child welfare that are used. And again, I'll do my best to try to explain all of them to you all, but did want to let you know, because you might hear them in some of the reporting you're doing and in some of the discussions you're having with people. So wanted to lay out a couple things so that they are clear. And I'll also let you know where the terms aren't clear in terms of how they're defined, so you have that sense as well. Transition age youth, as I mentioned, has become a term that we use and tends to cover the age of around 14 to mid-20s. This is one of those terms where I think you might see slight variations on the edges of whether it goes a little lower than 14 and whether it goes a little higher than 26. But this is about the range that we're talking about: adolescence, late adolescence, and kind of as you enter your 20s. That tends to be what we're talking about when we talk about transition age youth. And you'll notice that for this means we're talking about a time period that goes outside, to most degrees, the child welfare system, because most systems are ending at 18 or 21 with some exceptions. So we are talking about a time period that goes outside of kind of the child welfare system itself. A term that is very important to the child welfare system, but is a little awkward to use, I think, outside of the child welfare system, is this term of permanency. And permanency, kind of at its basic, means family, being part of a family. So a lot of times you'll hear that as soon as a child enters the child welfare system, the obligation of the system is to achieve permanency for them. And of course, the main goal is returning home, reunifying. But in one moment, I'll talk a little bit more about the other options for permanency. As I said, I do my best to not always use that term, because I know kind of for the public, permanency means a lot of different things. It can be used in a lot of different contexts. In the child welfare context, it really does have this very specific term and meaning, and that we are talking about something pretty significant, that we're either talking about, sometimes they call it relational permanency, which is just that sense of being part of a family and that connection, but not more importantly, but maybe more importantly for some of the legal work we do, legal permanency is that relationship. So the legal relationship that's with a parent, whether it be reunification or adoption or guardianship, that is really the end goal of the child welfare system. We don't want kids to grow up in the system. The ideal is reunification is always the priority and the first choice. And then you see on this slide kind of the hierarchy from reunification on. So adoption, guardianship, sometimes you'll hear in terms of kinship guardianship, but it doesn't necessarily need to be someone you're related to. It can be guardianship with someone that you have a lot of connection with, and sometimes that's called kin. The fourth permanency plan, which is a pretty vague one, I put it on the slide so you had a sense just what the law says. It's placement with a fit and willing relative. It is a pretty vague plan and doesn't always signify kind of permanency, because it's more about placement, but it definitely is something that's in our federal law. The least preferred permanency plan that we have is called another planned permanent living arrangement, and you will hear the jargon APLA, that acronym for that permanency plan. And I did want to introduce that concept to you all, because this is the permanency plan that many older youth get stuck with. And as I said, these permanency plans are what are in our federal laws, the options when kids enter the child welfare system. And you'll kind of note, and this is going a little beyond the 101, but when you say another planned permanent living arrangement, that doesn't sound very permanent to me. I don't even know what that is. That might be your response as a non-child welfare person, but for child welfare people, we have the same response. This isn't really much of a permanency setting, and it tends to look like for older youth in foster care that they're not living in a family setting. They might be in a group home. They might be in what we call an independent living placement, but it's not really kind of living with family or in a setting that you have kind of a permanent parent-like person. And so this is a permanency plan that's in the law that we are really concerned that a lot of older youth get stuck with. We'll talk more about that, but I just wanted to introduce those terms because, again, we'll do our best to not not use the jargon, but wanted you all to be aware of them if you heard them in your reporting, so you had a sense of what they were attached to, and then could ask more questions about them if you wanted to. Extended foster care is the term we use for continuing the foster care system past age 18. I think some of you on the call have done some reporting on extended foster care, and we'll talk about it more during this presentation. But there has been a move since 2008 and some changes in federal law to continue our foster care systems for kids who haven't been connected with family until age 21. And we'll talk about again the numbers of states that are doing that. That is the trend. But when we talk about a foster care system extending past 18, I usually refer to that as extended foster care. And I think that's kind of the term you're going to hear across the country. Sometimes you'll hear the state's Fostering Connections program, and sometimes that will signify extended foster care. But this is one way of talking about it that is, I think, pretty clear and doesn't leave as much ambiguity. Aging out is a term probably many of you have heard, and that is just a phrase that really means that a youth is leaving the child welfare system not because they've been placed with family, not because they've been reunified or adopted, but because of their age, whether it be 18 or 21. And again, that's the thing we really don't want to happen, but that is the thing that we see far too often is youth aging out. This last term that I put in, or phrase, is just something I wanted to highlight to you all. I know as reporters, you're often really forced to be as brief as possible and often have word limits. And so what I'm asking you to do, or what I'm kind of explaining that we do, is probably goes against what you do in writing and editing, which is be more wordy. We have tended to move away from using terms like foster youth and using more person-centered language. So we do use the term youth with experience in foster care as much as we can when we have a choice to be talking about kids who are still in the foster care system or who have aged out. And we do that not just because of the trend to be person-centered, which we want to be part of, but also because we really do consider hearing from youth really vital to our work, and that when we refer to them as foster youth, it really can be very demoralizing, and they feel like it's very stigmatizing, and that this is one part of who they are. It's for many of them extremely significant and really crucial to their identity, but describing them as youth with experience in foster care, I think shows more respect for who they are, who their voices are, and what their multiple kind of experiences and identities are. Again, I know in some of your writing and pressure, adding these so many words can be really challenging, but if you do have control over this, this is something that we definitely recommend and try to do as much as we do as we can when we're writing on our own and we have control of kind of the publication and things like that. And please do feel free to chat in other terms. And again, I'll try to not use acronyms and jargon when I can, but if I do say something that's not clear, please do ask a question. So I did want to start just with a little background about the transition to adulthood. And this is information that applies to all youth during this time period, not just youth in foster care. But it is important to consider when you're talking about kind of how we serve and treat and write laws and policies about this age group. And many of these things you've probably heard, because many of you, I think, do reporting on child welfare and probably juvenile justice, so have been up on all the things we're learning about adolescent brain development and other things around development. And so this might be repeating some things, but just wanted to highlight things that we feel like are really significant when we're doing our work. And the first is that adolescent brain development, that during your teens, late teens, and even early 20s, that young people's brains are still developing, and that really does impact kind of their behavior, how they process information, and how we serve them, and how what kind of responses we can get based on either the services we build and also how we interact with young people. And so I think that's really important. I think a lot of systems, including child welfare and juvenile justice, are acknowledging this. I think where the big challenges are where how do you go from acknowledging this to building your system differently? And that's where we face a lot of challenges. Because at this time period, youth really need a mixture of support, guidance, but also freedom to kind of experiment, to make mistakes, and have support. And these are things that systems, particularly state systems that are very kind of risk averse, are really have challenges to do. And so this again is kind of key to a lot of the work we do, because we don't just want to create systems that are available to youth, but we want them to actually work well for them and to be productive, have them be engaged with them, and really have them benefit from those things. The last two bullets are things, again, most of you probably know, either because you've been through this time period or you have kids who are kind of making this transition, is now, in our kind of time period, as we move towards 2020, and the economy has for many years been changing, we know that youth are taking, again, across the board, not just in foster care, are taking longer times to transition to adulthood. And when we say that, we're really talking about transitioning to adulthood. Kind of when they do the research, they're talking about, are you able to kind of establish yourself separately from your family, support yourself, be in the position to choose to have a family if you want to, and that tends to happen between like 25 and 27. And that's just important to think about, of how we create kind of these social systems. So if that is the age, and most of our systems end at 18 or 21, what are youth who aren't connected with family supposed to do? And how do we make up for those gaps? So I think that research is just important across the board. The last bullet is just about kind of an extension of that, of as this transition to adulthood takes a longer period of time, we're also noting, and again, for some of you on the phone who might have kids who are in this age period, you know how much time you are investing in this transition. And it is your blood, sweat, and tears, but it's also your financial support. And again, thinking about the amount of money and time and love and support and stress that parents put into their children during this time period, what does it mean for a young person that doesn't have someone or people who are going to do that? So again, just things we want to think about. And I'm going to be throwing a lot of data, including this, at you, but I do want to just take a moment to kind of ground this in kind of the reality of the transition to adulthood, because I do think it's important, and it's something that we spend a lot of time trying to get lawmakers and policy makers to be thinking about, of really just remembering what the teen years are, what the early 20s look like for all of us. And again, it's hard, I think, sometimes when you're closer to them to realize kind of all the support you needed to make it happen, all the people you relied on to really get to where you are. For me to go to law school, to be able to make those choices, to have that support, to go through all of that, or for someone else kind of making the decision, maybe to make different decisions about your career, be able to make a choice and then make a mistake and kind of change your mind, and have people to support you and talk you through certain issues. I think that it is very challenging for people in a policy position to remember what that's like. And it is very helpful when we are talking with policymakers that have a 21, 22, 23-year-old still living with them, and who they're still providing a lot of support. And really, when I say support, the research does talk about the finances, but I think what we do find is most crucial as people are making the transition to adulthood is actually the guidance and support, the calls home, the kind of knowledge of the support that you have is really crucial. And again, what do people do that when they don't have that? And so we have this time period when it is really challenging for a young person, but also for the people around them. They have a lot of demands on them. A lot of changes are going on biologically and developmentally, but also they're being asked to do a lot of things. They're being asked to make big decisions about their future, about whether they're going to go to college, whether they might just start and work and things like that. And then you add to that the overlay of being in the child welfare system. So you add that even in these changes that are natural and all youth across the board are experiencing, you're also going to have a young person who might, and for many youth in the child welfare system, have faced a significant amount of trauma and be separated from their family. So this is a youth who has a lot of challenges. Again, challenges that are going to be natural and that all youth face as they grow up, but then they're going to have these additional, I think, things to face. So these are things that are very complicated and overwhelming, but they are things that we try to kind of unpack and try to address as we're thinking about policy change. So if you do have a young person that is very close to you, or you just remember these years, I do think it's important as we go through this, and I throw a lot of data and law at you, to think about what that time period is like, what people need, and also, again, if you are a parent, the degree to which kind of you are doing a lot for your child. And again, for most parents, I think they say it is both a challenge and a huge privilege to do it, but it certainly is a significant amount of investment and support that parents put in to help and support their children. So one of the things I did throughout the presentation, we'll be giving you some citations, and as Katie said, we have 2 publications that you can download that have a lot of citations for data and research. But I did want to highlight a couple that are in this slide about adolescent brain development. If you want to kind of update yourself on some of these some of this information and how it more specifically impacts child welfare and youth in the child welfare system. On this slide is a couple of really excellent publications that we use, and they range for you so that you have a couple of things that are fact sheets and very short things. The video that we have, Turning Brain Strains into Gains, is really excellent. It's just a couple-minute YouTube video. So this gives you a range of resources if you're interested in kind of understanding this more and understanding it, the science, but more specifically how that plays out in the child welfare system. I did want to, again, kind of keeping with this idea of like, well, what does this mean for a real person who's transitioning to adulthood? What we tend to see happen, and this is from that Annie Casey publication that I've cited on the side, Brain Frames, Keeping the Family Conversation Alive, this kind of shows you what we see. And we're not saying this happens for all youth, but we're saying that this is kind of all too common. You have typical adolescent behavior of a teen, and again, as you guys know, that can be really challenging. So it's not always behavior we like. It can be very disruptive, but it is pretty normal for a young person as they're growing up, talking back, maybe not making curfew, all sorts of things that are challenging but are fairly typical as a young person grows up. So that typical behavior will be interpreted as kind of defiant or problematic, and the youth might be labeled as having a behavior problem, or they might be removed from placement. They might have multiple placements, or they might be going to group care because they'll say, oh, they have too many needs. As the youth gets older, then the focus will start to be, okay, you're getting older, so you're going to age out, so let's really focus on getting all your skills ready. So let's focus on school, let's focus on employment, all which are really important to focus on. But probably doing that to the exclusion of focusing on connecting with them with family. And then you kind of start to go down a path where you are really focusing on some of the behaviors that maybe are, again, challenging but part of adolescent development, but that you are creating a lot of instability in the youth life, either multiple placements or overly restrictive placements. And that arrow is pointing to that often that's the road to aging out. So this simplifies things, and I totally admit that it does, but I wanted to kind of give you guys, before we go into more specifics on numbers, of kind of the feeling of what it is like to be a real young person experiencing the transition to adulthood while in the child welfare system, but also what that might look like in terms to, well, why then would that young person age out? So now I'm going to jump into the numbers, which all of this data we have for you, so don't worry, you'll have the data and all the citations for it, so that you can, if you want to use it in your reporting. But basically, we just wanted to introduce that a good number of older youth are in the child welfare system. So the transition age youth population, the child welfare system makes up about 25% of the system. So that's a significant number of young people, and we just highlight that because that this is not like, oh, it's 2 to 10%. This is 1/4 of the system, and it is growing, and so that we really do need to have a response. This slide just gives you an idea of where youth are placed. So we do have, particularly as kids get older, we do see them finding them in greater numbers in group homes or institutions. And we do think that's a really important number to know, and also really disturbing number to know, because when youth are in group homes, again, thinking back to what you need as you transition to adulthood, even in the best group home, it's just incredibly difficult to provide a youth the kind of care that a parent would, that we really think youth deserve to be able to grow up and be cared for. So we really do think that these numbers are really disturbing, and that we really need to turn them around, because we need youth both to be returning home or in family-like settings, because we do think that's really going to have a really negative impact on their chances for success as they enter adulthood. And that term I told you about, permanency plans, again, really just means, what's the plan for connecting this youth with family. And this slide just tells you, so in the child welfare system, you have to assign a permanency plan within a year of a youth entering the child welfare system. And the plan can change over time, but it should reflect those priorities that I showed you in the beginning of the presentation. So it should really be focusing on reunification and adoption, and then guardianship, and then kind of going down the hierarchy. But you do see that while reunification remains a prominent permanency plan for youth, 16 to 17, the other family-based permanency plans really are reducing as youth get older, and then when they are in extended foster care, reduced even more, so that you talk about this plan of emancipation, which, again, we start to use these terms for older youth that have nothing to do with family. They really have to do with you're going to leave the system. They don't tell us much about how are you doing? Are you going to be connected with anyone? So this slide is just highlighting some of the trends we're seeing that we also think are disturbing in terms of leaving kids not connected with anyone, and really setting them up to be on their own as they transition. And this slide is kind of the one that really is the most disturbing. So that if you are in the child welfare system in the United States, there's over a 50% chance that you are going to age out if you are an older youth in the child welfare system. And when you think about odds, those are horrible odds. So this is really about kind of what has been happening in our system, that 56% of youth are aging out, of older youth are aging out without being connected to anyone. And those are our kids that are at the most high risk for poor outcomes. And another thing to note is that this number has not changed much at all in the last 10 years or so. And again, that's important to say. If we're really going to make changes in the direction, we have to have pretty radical policy changes. And then I wanted to just present this slide for you, and one of the publications that we're citing, which has been really helpful, is the Supporting Youth. I'm sorry, that's a typo. It should be young people. I apologize. Transitioning from foster care, a Child Trends publication. Child Trends is going to be a great resource to you all. I'm sure if you cover child welfare and juvenile justice, you use a lot of their data. But in the last 3 or so years, they've produced a ton of really excellent reports. There's a more recent one that we'll give you the citation for, but this one in 2017 did a great job of kind of looking at things across the country, but they also summarized some of the outcome data we have. And this just shows things that many of you probably are very aware of, which is just the poor outcomes of youth aging out. And this does a nice job of giving you the comparison of multiple outcomes in terms of graduation, connection with the criminal justice system, employment, and compare it to the general population. So I think most of you on the call are aware of this concept that youth aging out experience really poor outcomes in comparison to their peers. And this slide in this publication kind of gives you an easy to access kind of summary of a bunch of these things and the research sites for those. The other thing we wanted to highlight is that we are in general serving older youth in the foster care system pretty poorly across the board, but similar to other areas of child welfare, we're doing and serving even more poorly youth who are African American and Latino. So these outcomes are even more dismal for those young people. So all of our work, and I think you guys as reporters, you're like, the analysis has to consider race as well as other things like poverty and how it impacts all of these outcomes in terms of child welfare. And we're trying to do that as well, but we see the same disparities for older youth as well. So I'm going to kind of transition into going back to what we talked about in the beginning, extended foster care. So foster care that continues between 18 and 21. And these numbers just really show kind of what happens across the country when kids turn 18. And so we do have about close to 6,500 youth who are still remaining in care at 19, and I'll talk about the states, how that looks in the states. And so that is a pretty significant drop off in terms of the numbers who then, are leaving the system. That is something just to keep in mind. When you do look at the states, and we have in the materials, we have an extended foster care review, which I think some of you on the call have been using, and we have been trying to catalog the laws across the country for extended foster care and reentry. And just to recap, extended foster care would be that you would be staying in care after 18. Reentry means that you might decide to leave the system at 18 or 19, but that your state would allow you to come back in. And that has been a really important part of extended foster care because, again, thinking about adolescent development, normal adolescent development, there is that desire to go out on your own, to do it alone. But when you do that and you have a family, the door is opened. Traditionally in our foster care system, the door is shut when you leave. So reentry has been a really significant part of extended foster care, particularly for young people who will tell us having that option is really important, and that being able to have a place to go back to, even if it's not ideal to go back to the child welfare system, knowing that is really important. So right now we do have about 45 states that have extended foster care. We didn't do too much in this presentation about federal funding and Title IV-E. So this second column references the federal funds that states are able to draw down for their child welfare programs. And it is a significant source of funding for child welfare systems. And what this is just kind of making the distinction from is that some states have created extended foster care programs and fund them purely with their own state funds, while the majority have made their laws consistent with the federal law and the Fostering Connections law to allow them to be able to continue that IV-E federal money between 18 and 21. There's every incentive for states to do that, but the numbers show us that every state has not done that yet that's doing extended foster care. And for some of you who are more in the weeds about federal funding and financing, I'm happy to talk with you more about why this is significant and why we really want to encourage states to draw down those funds. Please feel free to contact me. I thought going into details of IV-E might be too much might take us a little beyond the scope of this, but please do feel free if you'd like to talk more about Title IV, either in extended foster care or across the board. 3 states do include youth who've been in JJ. There means juvenile justice, does allow youth from their juvenile justice system to opt into extended foster care. That's something we really would like to see more states do. We think youth in the justice system also need the support, but it right now is very much the rarity that we see in extended foster care. And then about 38 states allow youth to reenter. Again, a number we'd like to see go up, but we're really happy that number of states have that ability for young people. And it won't be surprising to you that the data does show us that providing support for a longer period of time provides better outcomes for youth. Again, we always need data and research to prove things, even when they are pretty self-evident. But having more support, not being put out on the street, having access to case management, having access to the court, knowing you have a bed to stay in at night, knowing that you have food to eat, that those are really important, and they allow youth to focus on some of the things they need to do as they're transitioning. And it also, frankly, gives us more time to connect youth with family. And the data is showing that even very small doses, even a couple more months, really do improve the chances for young people. This next slide talks about if you are interested and you're in a state that doesn't have extended foster care yet and you're asking around and talking with some of the advocates, one of the things that we do bring into this discussion is some of the cost analysis of just really the benefit of investing in extended foster care can have, not just for that individual young person, but for your community at large in terms of some of the costs that can be avoided by poor outcomes. So just wanted to introduce some of this research if you hadn't seen it, because if you are in a state that has not opted into extended foster care enacted statutes, some of this might be good questions to ask lawmakers about why they're not making this investment that really could save them in all sorts of spending beyond child welfare. And I'm sorry, before I go to that, one of the things I did want to point out about extended foster care, and I'll talk about this a little more in the themes, is that we as an office really do focus on extended foster care, and we do want to make sure every youth who needs it has access to it and that it's excellent for them, that it's really high quality. I will say that one of the things that we really like to make clear is that we don't want extended foster care to be necessary. We really want youth to be able to be reunified, be able to be connected with family, and not age out of the foster care system. So we want to not need extended foster care. And I think that we're doing as much as we can to really highlight that one of the most important things that youth need as they transition to adulthood, and you won't be surprised based on what I've been saying during this presentation, but is to be connected with family. That in the end, that's going to be the core thing around which you put all these other supports in terms of skill, education, employment, that having that connection, that support system is probably the most important thing we can do for young people. And it's one of the things we have done incredibly poorly at as a child welfare system. And we do, many of you, if you're on the call who've worked in child welfare, you know Kevin Campbell. He pioneered family finding. One of the things that he has said at some point is that extended foster care is the very least we can do for children in the child welfare system, and I agree with that. I think it needs to be available. We at our office will fight for it in every state and try to make it as high quality as possible, but we do think it's the absolute least we can do for our kids, and we should do so much more for them. So some of the themes that I think have emerged in kind of child welfare policy and transition age youth, and some of the things that I've tried to kind of highlight in the slides, is that they are a significant portion of the child welfare population, and so that does mean we need some kind of approach. They are at this high risk for poor adult outcomes if we don't serve them well. But the third, I think, bullet is really important, and we hope as reporters you will emphasize this, is while we have to, I guess we don't have to, but while we really do want to highlight some of the poor outcomes of youth, that happen when we don't provide the right supports and care, we do want to make clear that some of the most important insights from the adolescent development science and other things around development is that this is a time of great opportunity. This is a time when, if we do invest in young people, if we do give them the time and attention, so the completion of their or continuation of their brain development is done in a way that facilitates the growth we want to see. This is the time when they're making decisions about the direction of their future. When we do invest and support youth in the way that they deserve to be supported, the reward can be really great in terms of the lifelong kind of trajectories. This doesn't mean we can set everything in stone at this time period, but it does mean that it's a really influential time in development. And so we really do like to emphasize that there's such opportunity to make change in policy that can really play out for years and years. The other thing that we feel like is an important theme is that all these things that we've learned about adolescent development really have not penetrated the child welfare system in terms of kind of the services and supports that kids receive. And I think, we're working really hard to change that, because we do think that we have a system that right now is fairly punitive, is fairly restrictive, and is not really engaging of youth. And so what we tend to see is youth either not faring well or being pushed out. And so that is something we really feel like we need the system to better understand, and not just understand, but create services and policies that really reflect what they know and what we know about adolescent development. Some of the, I think, bright spots that we are seeing in terms of social policy and law is there definitely is an increased focus on investing in higher education supports for youth in foster care. So we are seeing examples of things like tuition waivers for youth who have experience in foster care. Pennsylvania just passed one, and about 28 other states have those programs. And we're also seeing more campus-based support programs for youth with experience in foster care that, again, are trying to embed in those programs some of the things that acknowledge what that young person may not have available to them, things like family support. So one of the great hallmarks of these programs are they understand a youth may not have a home to go home to during break. So these support programs help them with finding housing during campus breaks and things like that. So that's definitely been a positive trend. The other thing we've seen is some movement to extend supports into a young person's mid-20s. So fostering connections was kind of the first piece of legislation that at least gave states the incentive to go to 21. And that was a big move, but now we are seeing these other trends. So you all are probably very well aware of the Affordable Care Act allows parents to keep their kids on their health insurance until 26. The parallel of that for youth with experience in foster care is that they are eligible to be on Medicaid until age 26. So that definitely was a plus that really did acknowledge the transition is longer, and also acknowledge some of the challenges that youth with experience in foster care might have, and that they wouldn't have a parent whose insurance policy they could stay on. So making some of those allowances so that that could be part of the legislation. And then one of the laws that probably some of you have heard of and are covering your states, Family First Prevention and Services Act, did also have included within it options for states to provide services for youth longer. So they did allow youth, states that have extended foster care to provide this thing we call aftercare, so continuing support services for older youth until age 23, and also allowed states the options to provide these things we have called education and training vouchers, which is funding for higher education until age 26. For any of you who are reporting in the states, this is definitely something I'd encourage you to do some reporting on and ask questions about. One of the things that's been really frustrating with federal policy is that there's been this move to provide services for a longer period of time, but they're phrased to date, other than the Medicaid, they've been phrased as options. So we haven't seen as many states as we'd like to see take the option to extend aftercare to 23 or extend those education and training vouchers until 26. And those are things that would be great for reporters to ask people about. Why aren't you doing this? You know, this is an option that you have available, could enable you to provide more support. I don't want to make it too simple, because there's definitely some funding issues at stake with providing these services for longer, but these are definitely things that states can do, but when they're not mandated, it does mean some advocacy needs to be involved. Some of the continuing challenges are things that I've talked about throughout, is just our system hasn't been focusing sufficiently on kind of getting older kids back with their own families or connecting them with families. And we think that's just that really is significant, and that's probably kind of our top priority in terms of what we think, you know, young people need as they're transitioning. And to that, hasn't been as much of an investment in making sure that can be possible. So you all have probably heard in your states, you know, there's a shortage of foster families. You probably heard people don't want to take in older youth. And I think what we really need to, and what we're trying to work with states to do, is say, what is it that families need to be able to support young people? And if we don't have enough foster families, why is it that we don't? And New York City just put out a great report that gives a lot of detail about what they found as they've been looking at this issue. But there's definitely a lot of things we can do, and there's a lot of ways we can provide more support to families, whether it be the child's birth family or their kin, to really make it possible for them to support youth. And knowing that is such that in the end, the cost is so much less than having young people in group homes, and long term, the harm we do to youth when we put them in these restrictive and non-family settings is very significant. That these are things that we're really trying to dig into in the states, to really say, what is it that's getting in the way of supporting these family settings? Is it funding? Is it training? Is it support that families need? And how do we make sure that happens? And again, I really just feel like the challenge of not having a system that is aligned with adolescent development means that we have a lot of kids leaving systems, being pushed out, and it's really because they're not getting what they need. And we know that, you know, again, that young people can be very challenging, again, just as a product of their age. But systems and parents, we know how to deal with that, actually, and we know how to be both nurturing and supportive while also helping youth deal with challenging behavior and learn lessons. We do know how to do that, but our systems have trouble kind of operationalizing that. And I think the last bullet hopefully would be important to you all as reporters, is there's very little accountability for outcomes for older youth. When youth age out, people shake their head and they're very upset about it. But again, that number that we brought to you, that about 56%, over half of the older youth in our system age out without permanency. Like, that's a horrible, you know, track record for any institution, and there's very little accountability for that. And when we think of law and policy change, we really have been trying to think about how we can make sure there's more accountability in terms of data collection, but also in terms of outcomes that are produced. In terms of our priorities, we do really want to work towards having an increased investment in both accountability, but also services to help keep older youth with their families, or to reconnect them with families. We want to make sure everyone has access to high quality extended care if they haven't achieved permanency, and that is a real big challenge. We want to make sure the system is transformed to really be aligned with adolescent development. And we as lawyers do think lawyers have a really big role in making sure youth do get what they need in the child welfare system. So we do want to make sure youth have access to high quality client-directed attorneys who represent what they would like to happen. Not a best interest model, because the child welfare agency represents best interest. That we really need attorneys for kids that are representing what they want, as is kind of the traditional attorney-client model. And I'm happy, because I know that's a complicated issue, I'm happy to talk with people more if they'd like to hear more about kind of that debate and where things are across the country with right to counsel for kids in the child welfare system. And we do want to make sure that all of the work that we do and all the policy changes that happen in child welfare are really informed by the voices of young people. And we have we have 2 youth advocacy programs that we draw on a lot, but really encourage that to be part of all policy that we're working on or partners are working on. Things to watch in your states, and for each of these, again, I'm happy to talk more with people, particularly if you're in a particular state and want to know more. Family First is the big federal law that most child welfare people are most concerned with right now because people are in the process of implementation. And we do just want to make sure that older youth are benefit from this law, which is a really great law that really should push more investment in prevention and really should reduce the use of group care. But we do want to make sure that older youth kind of aren't forgotten. And as with many laws, there's exceptions to restrictions, and we do want to make sure that some of these restrictions on group care that we don't end up finding teens falling into them. So those are some of the things we think are important to watch out for. But again, we're happy to talk with some of you in more detail about your particular states and what's happening. And then again, we are seeing each year the number of states that have extended care growing, and that's really awesome. But watching that and also asking questions about the quality. So New Mexico enacted their extended foster care law last year. We think it was really well done, and they're going to be working on implementation. And I think they'll be a great state to see. Like, the hope is that they've learned from a lot of states, and so that's something that we encourage you all to look out for in your states. And then one really exciting thing that happened in the last couple months was HUD did put out a policy that will help young people who are leaving foster care access housing vouchers. And this is a really excellent opportunity, but as with all things, it requires certain things to happen before, it can actually impact young people. And so this would require housing authorities and child welfare agencies to do some collaboration. And again, for you all on the phone, if you're doing reporting in your state and want to talk more about like who to contact in your state about this, because the thing that has been really challenging about this is this policy, it's fairly new, but no one has taken advantage of it yet. And that's something we're trying to turn around and really be reaching out to housing authorities, advocates in states to say you have to bring your housing authorities that are eligible for this and child welfare agencies together. This is a great opportunity. This brings vouchers in for your young people. It doesn't take away from your other local populations, but you have to do these things. Here's how you do them. But that could be a great thing for reporters to be asking about, and it might spur some of this activity. So those are some of the things I think to look out for. There's tons of other things, but those are things that I thought might be most kind of timely in terms of what states are probably focused on or we'd like them to be focused on. I'm happy to take some questions about anything we've discussed, but also anything else you all are interested in.
This is Katie, and I'm going to be looking to see if there are any questions here in the question box. Let's see.
And Katie, I can explain in the handout section, what we have for you all is the first is older youth-related federal laws, and that gives you a summary of provisions of federal law that impact older youth. The second might be of most interest to you all, which it gives you a lot of the data we talked about today, and then all of the citations for that data. So I'm thinking that might be the most helpful for everyone on the call.
Yeah, and you can check for the handouts in the handout section. Yeah, I'm not currently seeing any questions. We're going to give it a minute more.
Sure.
We really appreciate you all joining us today. We're going to also make this available, this webinar, as a video and post it to our YouTube channel, which we will email out to you as well, and we're always happy to answer any follow-up questions you might have. So again, if you go into the handout section, you'll see the handouts that Jenny referred to. I'm going to take one last look at the questions section. Seeing none now, I think we'll wrap up, but feel free to contact Jenny. You can also contact press@jlc.org. And we appreciate you all participating in the webinar today. Thank you so much.